What if the biggest power shift in the Gulf didn't come from a massive invasion or a dramatic missile strike, but from one quiet move that made the whole world blink? Dramatic pause. Iran didn't just threaten the Gulf, it showed it could control its heartbeat. And once that happened, the balance of power was never quite the same again. In this video, we're breaking down the silent move that changed everything. How Iran turned the Strait of Hormuz from a shipping lane into a weapon, why Gulf states suddenly started talking very differently about security, and why the most shocking part of this story isn't what Iran destroyed. It's what it proved, because this wasn't just about ships, or oil, or even war. This was about leverage, cold, calculated leverage. And by the end, you'll see why some analysts believe Iran didn't need to win outright to change the game forever. So let's start with the obvious question. What was the silent move? Was it a new base? A hidden missile site? A backroom deal? Not exactly. The move was quieter than that, more strategic. Iran showed that it could choke the Strait of Hormuz, disrupt shipping, make insurers panic, push energy prices higher, and force everyone from Washington to Riyadh to recalculate what power in the Gulf really means. That's the story. And trust me, it gets even crazier, because for decades, the assumption was simple. Yes, Iran could cause trouble in the Gulf, but it couldn't truly rewrite the map. The United States had the Navy, the Gulf monarchies had money, infrastructure, and Western backing. Iran had missiles, proxies, and geography, sure, but it was still supposed to be the side under pressure. Then came the shift, and the shift wasn't loud in the usual cinematic way. It was quiet, because it happened through hesitation, bottlenecks, fear, rerouting, insurance rates, mine-clearing operations, diplomatic panic, and a terrifying realization. The side that controls the narrowest point doesn't need to sink the whole fleet to make everyone obey. Think about that. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical waterways on Earth. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows through it. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes are just about 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles. That's it. That is the tiny, fragile corridor through which massive tankers carry the fuel that powers cities, industries, airlines, militaries, and whole economies. So when Iran demonstrated that it could make that artery unsafe, slow, expensive, or functionally blocked, the message wasn't just military, it was global. Suddenly, this wasn't a regional nuisance. It was a pressure point on the world economy. And here's the twist. Iran didn't need to permanently conquer the Gulf. It just needed to prove it could hold the trigger. That's where things take a dark turn. Reuters reported that Iran effectively blocked traffic through the strait, using attacks on civilian vessels, mines, and demands for passage fees, creating a situation where commercial transit became too dangerous or too uninsurable. Let that sink in. Not a full naval showdown, not some giant D-Day style battle, just enough pressure, enough risk, enough unpredictability to make the world's most important shipping corridor feel unstable. And instability in the Gulf is power. Why? Because power in the Gulf has always been about one thing: confidence. Confidence that energy will keep flowing, confidence that ports will keep functioning, confidence that tankers will keep moving. Once that confidence cracks, the balance starts shifting immediately, and that's exactly what happened. But wait, you won't believe what happened next. The old assumption was that Gulf states had built workarounds. Saudi Arabia had pipelines. The UAE had routes outside the strait. Rich states had redundancy, or so everyone thought. Then the war and disruption exposed something brutal. Even the backups were vulnerable. Reuters reported that Saudi Arabia, which had been exporting around 8 million barrels per day before the war, said attacks cut its production capacity by around 600,000 barrels per day and reduced throughput on its east-west pipeline by about 700,000 barrels per day. The UAE's export pipeline to Fujairah, outside the strait, was also repeatedly struck. And for Qatar and Kuwait, the problem was even worse. the strait remained their only export route. That's the moment the illusion broke. Because the story was never just, can Iran close Hormuz? The scarier question was, can anyone in the Gulf truly escape Hormuz? And the answer started looking like no. No fully safe bypass. No clean alternative. No magical detour around geography. Suddenly, the Gulf's most advanced energy states looked exposed in a way many of them had spent years trying not to admit. This is where the silent move becomes genius in a very dangerous way. Iran didn't just threaten ships, it threatened the idea that the Gulf's economic system could be insulated from Iranian pressure. That changes everything, because if you are Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, or even global importers in Asia, you are no longer asking, can Iran cause disruption? You are asking, how much of our national future can Iran hold hostage when it wants to? That is a completely different conversation. And it gets even more serious. According to Reuters, around 11 million barrels per day of oil production and Qatar's entire LNG output were forced offline during the crisis. Shipping in Hormuz reached a virtual standstill. Think about the scale of that. This wasn't a headline spike that disappeared in 6 hours. This was the kind of shock that makes governments hold emergency meetings, traders freak out, insurers raise costs, supply chains tense up, and military planners quietly ask questions they don't want to answer out loud. Questions like, if Iran can do this with limited effort now, what happens in the next crisis? If the Gulf states can be rattled this badly, who is really shaping the region's security order? And if Washington still has the most powerful military on the planet, why does the strait still feel so vulnerable? That's the uncomfortable part. Because the power shift here is not about Iran becoming stronger than the United States in a traditional sense. It's about Iran proving it can impose costs in a way that stronger powers cannot easily neutralize without taking on huge risks themselves. Reuters reported that U.S. intelligence warned Iran was unlikely to ease its chokehold on Hormuz anytime soon because this leverage over the strait was its most potent pressure point against the United States. One expert quoted by Reuters put it brutally. In trying to stop Iran from building a weapon of mass destruction, the U.S. may have handed Iran a weapon of mass disruption. And honestly, that line explains almost the whole story. Because what is mass disruption in the Gulf? It's not always bombs falling on capitals. It's tanker traffic freezing. It's fuel shortages. It's rising inflation. It's fragile governments facing economic stress. It's political leaders realizing that one narrow stretch of water can rewrite the terms of negotiation. This is why the move was silent. It didn't arrive with one giant cinematic moment. It arrived through pressure, through uncertainty, through the realization that Iran's geography, drones, missiles, and maritime harassment tools were more strategically valuable than many outsiders had been willing to admit. And here comes the next twist. Even reopening the strait isn't simple. You might think, okay, the U.S. Navy is the U.S. Navy. Surely it can just sail through, clear the water, and restore order. But Reuters reported that experts warned any military effort to fully reopen Hormuz would be risky and might not even succeed. Why? Because even if U.S. forces seized the southern Iranian coast and islands, Iran's Revolutionary Guards could still use drones and missiles launched from deep inside Iran to keep the waterway under threat. In other words, the strait is not just a place, it's an ecosystem of vulnerability. You don't need to own every inch of it to dominate it psychologically and economically. All it takes is the credible threat that one or two drones, one mine, one hit on a tanker, one insurance spike, one burst of panic could make the route feel too dangerous. That is terrifyingly efficient leverage. Reuters even reported that U.S. warships later crossed the strait as part of plans to start removing mines. Stop right there. Mine clearing in one of the world's most important waterways. That tells you everything. Once mine clearing enters the story, everyone understands the stakes are no longer theoretical. This is no longer about rhetoric. It's about restoring the basic ability of the global economy to breathe. But wait, it gets even crazier. Iran wasn't just using disruption to survive the crisis. It appeared to be thinking beyond it. Reuters reported that Iran floated ideas about retaining leverage over the strait, even under a future peace deal, including controlling traffic and charging vessels a transit fee. Read that again. Not just temporary disruption, not just wartime pressure, structural leverage, a possible future where Iran tries to turn one of the world's most vital energy corridors into something closer to a toll booth. That is not just escalation, that is ambition. And if you're a Gulf state hearing that, your entire strategic worldview changes overnight. Because now the question isn't whether Iran can lash out when cornered. The question is whether Iran is trying to lock in a new regional reality where its control over insecurity becomes a permanent bargaining chip. That's the kind of thought that keeps Gulf leaders awake at 3 a.m., and Reuters shows they are indeed thinking that way now. Gulf officials reportedly told Washington that ending the war alone would not be enough. They wanted Iran's ability to weaponize Hormuz curbed permanently. They wanted missiles, drones, proxy threats, and attacks on energy infrastructure addressed directly. In other words, the Gulf states were no longer talking as if the old status quo could simply be restored. That's huge, because once regional powers stop thinking in terms of de-escalation and start thinking in terms of permanently degrading one rival's capabilities, it means something fundamental has changed in their perception of danger. The shock went deep. The Gulf monarchies realized that their prosperity, their development plans, even their drinking water infrastructure in some cases, could be dragged into a confrontation they didn't fully choose and couldn't fully control. Reuters reported that Gulf states had warned Washington directly that strikes on Iran's power plants would trigger Iranian retaliation on their own vital energy and desalination facilities. That's not a side note. That is the Gulf admitting that the battlefield is no longer limited to front lines or military bases. The battlefield is pipelines, ports, tankers, power, desalination, refineries, LNG, airports, and confidence itself. And when confidence becomes a battlefield, the side that can spread fear fastest starts changing the balance of power. This is where things take a really sharp turn. Traditionally, Gulf security rested on an unwritten formula. America would deter the big threats, and Gulf states would keep the energy flowing. Iran's silent move exposed the weakness in that formula. Yes, the U.S. could strike. Yes, it could deploy. Yes, it could escort. But could it guarantee that Gulf energy systems would stay untouched, unblocked, and psychologically secure? That answer suddenly looked a lot less certain. And once deterrence looks uncertain, alliances start being measured differently. Gulf states begin asking harder questions. Is American protection enough? Do we need new missile defense systems, more direct military integration, more hedging, more diplomacy, more independence, more tolerance for risk? The fact that these questions get asked at all means the power balance has moved, not necessarily by territory, not by formal surrender, but by fear, leverage, and strategic imagination. You see, the most powerful moments in geopolitics are often not the ones that redraw borders. They're the ones that redraw expectations, and Iran redrew expectations in the Gulf. It showed that the supposedly protected economic core of the region could be shaken, throttled, and held under pressure. It showed that bypass routes might not bypass enough. It showed that even a superpower has to think twice when the battlefield is a narrow shipping lane under constant asymmetric threat. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that the Gulf states themselves now see the old arrangement as broken. That may be the biggest shift of all. Because when Reuters reports that Gulf states are telling Washington a ceasefire isn't enough, that Iran's missile and drone capabilities must be curbed, and that the rules of engagement must be rewritten, what they're really saying is this: the old Gulf order failed the stress test. That is a historic statement, even if it isn't shouted from a podium. And here comes the part most people miss. Iran's move wasn't only about making others feel weak. It was also about turning weakness into leverage. Iran has taken damage. It has faced pressure. It has been squeezed. But instead of simply absorbing those hits, it found the one place where it could still shape the choices of bigger, richer, better-armed adversaries. That is strategy, real strategy. Find the artery, grip it, don't overextend, don't try to win everything. Just prove you can stop the system from feeling safe. Once you do that, everyone has to negotiate around you. That's exactly what makes this so powerful. Iran did not need to dominate the Gulf conventionally. It only needed to prove that no lasting Gulf order is possible without dealing with Iran's ability to disrupt it. That's the message. And honestly, that's why this story matters so much beyond the Middle East. Because this is a preview of modern power. Not always tanks rolling through capitals, sometimes it's choke points, sometimes it's drones over trade routes, sometimes it's making commerce feel one insurance premium away from collapse, sometimes it's turning geography into a political weapon. And when that happens, even countries that look weaker on paper can suddenly look much stronger in practice. Dramatic pause. So what was Iran's silent move in the Gulf? It wasn't silence in the literal sense, it was strategic silence, the kind that slips past people because it doesn't look like a Hollywood war scene. It looks like delayed tankers, higher oil, nervous capitals, mine-clearing operations, exposed pipelines, emergency diplomacy, and then, only later, everyone realizes the truth. This wasn't just disruption, it was a demonstration that the balance of power in the Gulf no longer depends only on who has the biggest navy or the richest allies. It also depends on who can make the narrowest point in the system feel impossible to trust. And here's the final twist. The most shocking thing Iran may have changed wasn't the map, the ports, or even the oil market. It may have changed how every Gulf capital imagines the next war. Before, they feared escalation. Now they fear entrapment. Before, they feared attack. Now, they fear being made permanently vulnerable. Before, they believed the Gulf order could be restored after each crisis. Now, many of them seem to believe the rules themselves have to be rewritten. That is a genuine shift in power. Because power is not just the ability to strike. It is the ability to change what others think is possible. And with one silent move around Hormuz, Iran may have done exactly that. So the next time someone asks whether Iran really changed the balance of power in the Gulf, ask them this. If one narrow waterway can shake oil markets, expose pipelines, frighten allies, force mine clearing, and make the region demand an entirely new security order, then who is really setting the terms now? If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, was this a temporary disruption or the beginning of a completely new Gulf order?